Most of the people who are watching my videos are men. It's about 91% actually. Female human beings are very choosy maters. But I'll tell you something else that's really weird. I don't understand this either. So, more than 90% of the people who watch my videos on YouTube are men. Now that's weird. Human females are picky maters. They're choosy. They're also sneaky because you can't tell when they're ovulating, and with many other female animals you know. So they have hidden ovulation and they're choosy. And you might say, well, it's because of the political stance I've taken. And I thought, well, that's possible. So I went and looked at the demographic data because I have that. Well, before I did any of the political videos, 85% of my viewers were men. So it's actually increased a bit. It's increased by 6%. And that's not trivial, but it was still overwhelmingly men. So that was interesting. I thought, what the hell? Why is that exactly? Women became more vulnerable at certain key points of their lives because they had increasingly fragile babies. Now, how did women deal with that? Well, I think they shamed men into becoming caregivers of children. And I looked around the room and I thought, hey, 80% of the people in this room are men. So I had all the women stand up and then all the men stand up. I said, look, like, here's a natural experiment. For some reason, 80% of the people who showed up to this are men. Now, everybody thought I was kind of cracked to do that. And it was a risk, you know, but I thought, no, there's something going on here. And then what's interesting now is that every public appearance that I've made that's related to the sort of topics that we're discussing is overwhelmingly men. It's like 85 to 90%. And so I thought, wow, that's weird. Like, what the hell's going on here exactly? Because how else would it have happened? Like, the typical mammal male doesn't hang around provisioning the litter. You know, in fact, some of the males will eat the cubs. You don't want a male black bear around. Wolves are an exception to this. And, you know, there are animals that are an exception. It happens in other species other than human beings. One of the things I tell young men, well, and young women as well, but the young men really need to hear this more, I think. More than 90% of the people who watch my videos on YouTube are men. Now that's weird. You should be a monster, an absolute monster, and then you should learn how to control it. More than 90%. We're suffering from a radical influx of female-type antisocial behavior. That's cancel culture, that's reputation destruction and savaging. And so, but we can't have a conversation about that because all the pathology is on the male side. It's like, no, all the pathology isn't on the male side. Plain and simple. There's social pathologies that have a feminine orientation, and that would be the infantilization of everything. And then there's toxic femininity, which is this tendency to derogate into savage reputations and to escape scot-free in the aftermath of that. And the use of manipulation and innuendo and all of that. Very, very difficult to cope with. Very difficult to put boundaries around, too. Overwhelmingly men. So that was interesting. I thought, what the hell? Why is that exactly? So the whole notion that, you know, we're awarding positions of privilege to oppressive patriarchal types, it's like, we just have to get rid of that. Enough of that. That's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. And the other thing, too, is, you know, it's only been 30, 40 years, 50 years since women had reliable birth control, right? And we're able to enter the workforce en masse. I'll tell you, man, we've produced a cultural revolution in like 50 years. Women are everywhere. And I looked around the room and I thought, hey, 80% of the people in this room are men. The fact that half of our corporate board members aren't women is not indicative of the fact that we live in an unconsciously biased, misogynistic, patriarchal society. Sorry, wrong, not correct. For some reason, 80% of the people who showed up to this are men.
You talk about the so-called oppression of the patriarchy. But
yes.
Women were oppressed for centuries. I mean,
well, that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is that men and women were oppressed for centuries. I mean, there are certain burdens that women bore that men didn't bear, but the opposite is equally true. Yeah, men suffered dreadfully, for example, in incredibly dangerous occupations. What the hell are we going to do without men? These men, they're doing impossible things. I don't buy the historical narrative that the fundamental reality of our history was that men were oppressing women. First of all, women aren't that easy to oppress, as you might have noticed if you've ever had a relationship with them. Every public appearance that I've made that's related to the sort of topics that we're discussing is overwhelmingly men.
But is a fact that women suffered more than men?
I don't believe that, no, and I don't think it is a fact. Sorry, wrong, not correct. Women certainly do make men self-conscious. It might be the primary effect that women have on men. That's advantageous in that more conscious men are better, but it's disadvantageous for the men in that self-consciousness is generally a very unpleasant emotion. So I would say, however, that self-consciousness is the guideway to transcendence and development, and so the best thing for human beings to do is to bear up underneath their self-conscious tragedy and to transcend past that by becoming even more conscious.
It is clearly the case that the surgical operation performed by the butchers who butchered Elliot/Ellen was legal. So, was it criminal or not? Were the operations undertaken by the fascist physicians who carried out the Nazi medical experiments legal? Yes, under the laws of the time. But were they criminal? I'll leave that question up to you to answer.
If you are suffering in your half-awake state, then it's time to wake up completely, and then perhaps that will go away. Well, we don't know, but we don't have a better option. The other option is annihilation.
Wow, that's weird. Like, what the hell's going on here exactly?
The most radical end of the left-wing political agenda is logically impossible.
If your kids are in a class where they talk about diversity, equity, inclusivity, gender, white privilege, that's not a bad, there's other words too, but we'll stick with those, that your kids should be encouraged to leave the class because they're not being educated, they're being indoctrinated.
What you see on the left is that there's this weird paradoxical demand, let's say, that people should be allowed to express their sexuality in any manner that they choose whenever they want is logically impossible. But that sex is so dangerous that it has to be carefully regulated at every single stage of the interaction. And so you know that many state legislatures have now followed the example of university campuses and put it in affirmative consent legislation so that every move you make towards physical intimacy has to be preceded by the instantiation of a verbal contract, essentially. It's like, well, can I take your hand? Yes. You actually, from what I understand, you actually have to say yes. Like, nodding is not sufficient. And so each stage has to be preceded by affirmative consent. And, you know, which well, I won't say anything about, yeah, I will. It's absurd. It's absurd.
Yeah. Women aren't that easy to oppress, as you might have noticed if you've ever had a relationship with them. No, there's something going on here.